So last time we talked about the project life cycles, the difference between waterfall and agile project life cycles. So I want to get into a little bit more detail about the differences between waterfall and agile and kind of what the different artifacts are. So there's waterfall, which follows a more sequential approach to managing a project, where agile follows a more iterative approach to managing a project. And then there's a third approach called a hybrid, where you might do initiation and planning up front to understand the scope, and then to understand the backlog of your requirements. And then once you've built a backlog of requirements, then you'd execute on it in a more agile approach, which is a more iterative approach, where you take a group of your requirements that are in your backlog, divide them up into different sprints, and then design, develop, test, and deploy in iterations to those requirements. Once you've delivered and gotten to a point where you have a usable product, then you proceed with the closing phase. So that's meant to be, that's a hybrid approach to managing a project. So this is meant to give you an outline of different types of document or artifacts that might be needed within each of the phases of a waterfall type project. So in initiation, you have, defining your scope, your initial risks, assumptions, constraints that would go into the development of a project charter document. Then once you get into planning, you proceed with identifying your requirements, any additional constraints or assumptions. You're identifying your project team, roles, responsibilities. You're starting to create your work breakdown structure, developing a change management plan, continuing to identify and manage risks, and then ultimately you obtain approval on the requirements documents that you've put together. Once you have agreement, you proceed into the execution phase, where you execute on the tasks that have been identified for designing, developing, delivering and testing the different requirements that were identified and agreed upon. You're continuing to manage your risks and your issues, manage and issue any change requests that might deviate from what was agreed upon originally in terms of scope, schedule, or budget. Once you've completed the execution, you're ready to close out the project and obtain final acceptance of the product or project deliverables. You might do a lessons learned, measure customer satisfaction, and archive your project records. Down at the bottom represents continuing to monitor and controlling the scope and what's being managed and delivered on the project. And then you're also constantly gathering knowledge about the project and archiving the different document artifacts into a knowledge repository. So this is meant to highlight the different types of document artifacts and activities that you might perform during the different phases of a typical waterfall type of project. This is meant to be a similar depiction in a little bit more detail of the different types of artifacts that you might need to manage within the project. But we talked about tailoring before, right? So just as you're going to tailor the type of methodology and project management approach that you're going to use to manage your project, you're also going to tailor your project to only create and manage the different artifacts and get sign off on the artifacts based on the scope and complexity and type of project that you're managing. But this is meant to be a fairly comprehensive view of different types of artifacts that you might need to develop and put together and get sign off on throughout the course of managing your project. So even before the project starts, within origination, there's a business case, but that usually gets put together by whoever your business sponsor is before you get assigned to the project and the project starts. But once the project starts, you get into initiation, then you proceed with managing. Once you get agreement of your requirements and planning and requirements, then you proceed with execution. And these are the different artifacts that might get put together during execution. And then during execution and control, you're controlling the ongoing execution and management of your project. The next thing I want to talk about is the Agile Manifesto. So the Agile approach to managing projects basically dates back to and is based on ideas that are part of the Agile Manifesto, which was written in 2001. It was originally developed with the mindset of how software application projects can be better delivered and how software in general can be more efficiently delivered. So the consensus around the core values are that individuals and interactions are more important over processes and tools. Working software is more important over creating a bunch of comprehensive documentation that a lot of people probably won't even read. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And the basic idea here is that there's more value in the items on the right, but we value the items on the left more. 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto. The first one is that our high priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So in the traditional waterfall approach to managing projects, you might go through a 3 or 6 month process on identifying and documenting the requirements that need to get delivered, the scope of the requirements that need to get delivered, and then spend another 6 months developing those requirements. And then you're a year later on actually delivering the project. Well, a year is a long time. So the idea is that instead of waiting a year before you get feedback on what you're delivering, you're going to get feedback all along the way, assuming that your customer and key stakeholders are involved in the process of identifying and verifying requirements along the way. So instead of relying on a project change request process and getting sign off whenever requirements are changed, in an Agile world, in an Agile project, you welcome requirements. The idea is that new requirements can be added along the way, but you may not deliver on every one of those requirements once it's determined that a certain amount of functionality has been developed and delivered as part of your project. Can anybody tell me what the concept of MVP stands for? And it doesn't mean most valuable player, but there's a concept related to Agile that's known as MVP, or delivering an MVP. Has anybody heard of that concept before?
Is it minimum viable product?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a basic concept within an Agile project approach is to deliver a minimum viable product, which is an MVP. So you're going to keep identifying more and more requirements and grouping those requirements into sprints, what are called sprints. And delivering iteratively on those sprints and those requirements until you've achieved what's known as an agreed upon minimal viable product with your stakeholders. And minimal viable product is something that's usable and tangible and by your users in terms of a product or service that you might be delivering. You're going to keep welcoming new requirements even late in the cycle. And as new requirements are identified and added to the requirements backlog, you're going to keep iterating on those requirements through subsequent sprints. The next item is delivering working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. So keep in mind, this Agile manifesto was developed back in 2001 specifically for software. In today's world, and the reason I think it's important for you guys to understand about Agile is it's becoming more and more common, a more and more common technique and approach for managing and deliver projects. And they don't have to be software development projects. They can really be any kind of projects. I think at least a couple of you are involved in or have been involved in Agile projects. Is that right? Can anybody share kind of at a high level what your experience has been in an Agile world and been involved in either managing or being a part of an Agile type project?
Well, in my experience, it was a subset of a larger project that was actually following out. The large project was, I'd say, on a waterfall process, but the software development for an electronics module was following an agile process where they had multiple sprints so that the software and firmware could be continuously run and updated. And then that would end development and go into the electronics module that was on a larger mechanical project device that was more in the waterfall.
The reason there are different project management methodologies is that not every type of project may lend itself well to an agile environment type of project. The organization that you're in may not lend itself well to an agile, delivering an agile type of project. We're going to talk more about what those characteristics are, but there may be, as you're saying, a project environment, a larger project environment that lends itself well to the traditional sequential waterfall approach, but a subcomponent or a sub-project that lends itself well, like a software development project that lends itself well to an iterative approach. Anybody have any other experiences they'd like to share?
Yeah, for where I work, we were doing a repair for an F5 wing canopy and aft fuselage. And any aircraft repair, you see what you see, you make your plan for it, and then you get halfway through it and you realize something's wrecked on the inside and your whole plan changes.
Yep.
So that's pretty an agile project management style in terms of redeveloping your requirements in order to get something flight worthy, in order to go back to your customer, get more cost associated to the project, and update it that way.
That's a great point. One of the benefits of an agile approach is, and one of the concepts is that it's better to fail earlier in the process and fail often, so then you can make corrections early in the process. If you fail early, it's less expensive than you wait till the end of a 9 or 12 month project and you realize, oh, what you had delivered isn't going to work for the customer, and then that ends up being a very expensive proposition. So that's one of the key advantages of agile is to learn from your mistakes early, make corrections along the way, and then continue to deliver based on what needs to get delivered and what's going to work.
I was brought onto the California Edison as a contractor, and they had a huge project in training the whole enterprise on safety. So I was brought in to do part of the analyst work, executing some of the breakdowns of how to come to that common goal. So as I'm sitting here listening and looking at exactly the waterfalls and the agile, I believe what the project that I was brought in to work on was based on agile. The reason why I say that is because there were times where we would think that something was working on how to execute training to the whole enterprise, and then all of a sudden it wouldn't work. Something would happen, and you'd have to go back to the drawing board and go back and change. And then we had like this, I create a change log and any type of feedback of anything that may have to change in order to make the process easier, and for the facilitators and even for the people who were getting the training. So now that I see the breakdown between waterfall and agile, that the project that I was asked to do was aligning with the agile part because of all the changes that had to happen in order to make the project.
Yeah, typically in an agile project, you have the requirements that are delivered are broken up into what's called sprints. And even before the project starts, there's an agreed upon cadence that's going to be used in an agile approach on delivering the requirements. So you have your product requirements backlog, and usually the cadence of delivering sprints is identifying what you can realistically deliver within a 3-week period, could be 4-week period, 5, 6 week period. I haven't typically seen the cadence go longer than 6 weeks in terms of delivering sprints, but what's more common is a 3-week sprint. So the first couple of days of a sprint, what the team does is they'll get together, they'll look at the product requirements backlog, they'll working closely with their business customers or key sponsors and stakeholders, and identify what are those highest priority requirements, and making sure they have a good understanding of the priority of those requirements that are in the backlog. And then what the team does is they'll go through and they use what's called a point estimation system and identify, okay, these are the number of points that we can deliver within a 3-week period. So let's say your backlog has 100 requirements in it, and it's identified that the team can deliver realistically the first 10 requirements within the next 3-week period. So they'll carve off that chunk of requirements, and that's all they focus on within the next 3 weeks is all the work that needs to get done to deliver on those 10 requirements. Let's say, and then as the requirements get delivered, the team keeps track in what's called a burn down chart of what's being delivered on a daily basis. Some of the requirements may not get completed. Whatever doesn't get completed will roll over to the next sprint. But when at the end of the 3-week period, there's a retrospective that happens that the team will perform. What did we do well? What did we not do well? What adjustments do we need to make? And then they'll complete that sprint. The next 3-week cycle starts up. The team identifies what can be delivered within the next 3-week period, and the team keeps going in these 3-week sprint cycles until they've achieved what's an agreed upon minimal viable product for the product or service that's being delivered. One of the key aspects here is that the business sponsors are very closely involved, helping to identify what the requirements are and prioritizing the requirements so that the team is always working on those highest priority requirements first. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them an environment that they know that they can need. One of the concepts of Agile is for the team to be self-motivated and self-organizing so that they organize themselves and decide, working with their business sponsors, what needs to get delivered next on the project. It's meant to be a more efficient and effective method of conveying information. People are working closely a lot of times in the same room outside of the quarantine environment that we're in now. Typically, an agile team will self-organize themselves and be closely together in the same location, working in the same room together, so they can be constantly talking and communicating with each other on what needs to get done next on the project. Development team, face-to-face conversation and interaction. These days, Agile is still working. It still works, but people are on video conference calls like this, working closely together and still in an Agile approach to develop. There's a concept of a daily stand-up meeting. In these daily stand-up meetings, the team gets together and they'll go around the room, and each member of the team will talk about what are they working on now? What did they just complete? What do they plan to work on? What issues or roadblocks are they coming up against in order to continue to make progress towards the 3-week sprint cycle? But everybody is working on what needs to get done within that current 3-week sprint cycle on the identified requirements that they're focused on. Working software or a working product is the primary measure of progress. Agile processes are meant to promote sustainable and ongoing development, with the sponsors, developers, and users maintaining a constant pace indefinitely until the project or product has been delivered. Continuous attention is paid to technical excellence, with the idea that good design enhances increased agility within the project team. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential and keeps it simple. It's meant to be a simple approach to continuous progress on a project. Only the best architecture's requirements are designed, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And then the last principle is at regular intervals, which is the sprint approach that I talked about. The team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts for the next sprint cycle so that they can do things better, more efficiently, and more effectively throughout the course of the project. And all of this comes from a site called the agilealliance.org. So if you want to learn more about the Agile Manifesto and principles of Agile project management and product development, there's all kinds of information you can refer to out at this agilealliance.org website. Just like we had artifacts related to the waterfall approach, this slide is meant to outline what are those key artifacts and what are the roles that are involved in a sprint type of project. So you have your product owner, which is generally somebody from the business who owns the requirements and sets the priorities on the requirements that need to get delivered next. The Scrum Master is meant to manage the process and remove any roadblocks that team members might encounter. Although the Scrum Master and Project Manager are not always the same, they can be the same person. The team is made up of, the team members that have specific skills in helping to develop the product or service that's being delivered. And then the stakeholders are meant to advise and observe and give input along the way as the product or service is being developed. The key artifacts, as I mentioned, the product backlog or the requirements backlog are one and the same thing. The sprint goal is the goal of the current sprint. The sprint backlog is meant to be a backlog of items that are going to be, or requirements that are going to get accomplished within the current sprint. In that 3-week sprint cycle, as I mentioned. The blocks list is really similar to an issues list. What are those key lists of items or issues that are blocking progress on continuing to deliver the requirements in the backlog and in the current sprint backlog. And then the increment is meant to be the cycle. What's the version of the product you're working on? When you get to the end of a sprint cycle, you may have something that's shippable and deliverable, or you may not. So if you don't have something that's deliverable yet, you would reiterate again to the next sprint cycle and continue to iterate until you have something that's a viable product that is deliverable. Once you get to the minimum viable product, then it's up to the sponsors and the team to determine, okay, do you need to continue to iterate? As long as it's determined and agreed upon, and that the resources and there's sufficient budget available to continue to iterate, you can continue iterating on subsequent sprints and delivering subsequent requirements that continue to be identified in the backlog. The project continues until basically the available budget has been exhausted, and or the resources that are working on the team are no longer available. Some of the key meetings that take place are, you have your sprint planning meetings that happen, usually the first day of the sprint cycle. And that's where it's identified what requirements are going to get delivered during the current sprint cycle and what the highest priority items are in the backlog. Your daily scrum meeting is that daily stand-up meeting that I mentioned. So where all the team members get together and go around the room and identify, what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? What's in your way? What's blocking you from making progress? So everybody has a chance to give their input, with the idea that once it's meant to be a 15, 20-minute meeting at the most. And then at the end of that 15, 20-minute daily meeting, then everybody goes off and works on what they have said that they're going to work on and accomplish during that day. The idea is that on a daily basis, the team is constantly making progress towards delivering the requirements that have been agreed upon that are part of this current sprint cycle. The sprint review meeting happens at the end of the sprint cycle. That's where you get together, the team gets together with the product owner and the key stakeholders and reviews what's been delivered for that cycle. And then you get agreement, and as part of that sprint review meeting is a retrospective about what could be done better during the next sprint cycle. On the right identifies a diagram of a typical sprint cycle and how the product backlog and how you're constantly iterating fits into this agile approach to managing a project.
One note, I've been involved in a process like that where you have the daily stand-up meeting. And I've been in those where they have dragged on and they become sort of rehashing details day to day, the same details. So it's important, I think, to stay to what the immediate outcome was a result of what you did, say, the day before, and what's your immediate item the next day or roadblock for the next day. Just a point rather than just a continuous status update, because they get repetitive and long.
That's the responsibility of the Scrum Master or the project manager who's involved in the project. It's their responsibility to make sure that the process is adhered to. Agile is meant to be very process light compared to a traditional waterfall type of project. But it is important that the Scrum Master and or project manager make sure that those daily meetings are no longer than 15, 20 minutes tops, and that the team members are adhering to and staying focused, as you said, on what was done yesterday, what was accomplished, what you're going to work on today, and then what are those roadblocks. And it's up to the Scrum Master and the project manager to make sure that any roadblocks that are identified are taken care of and removed, basically.
Okay, when a project needs to initiate change, like let's say a roadblock, it's like turns into like we need to change the scope or change something to the plan. Is that a part of another meeting that would need to take place to initiate that change in the plan?
Actually, the agile approach to project and product development and project management really eliminates the need for project change requests. When it comes to the requirements that need to get delivered, the idea behind Agile is as new requirements are identified, they are constantly being added to the requirements backlog and prioritized by the product owner. So as far as requirements are concerned, they continue to get added and prioritized and can continue to be delivered. The only caveat to that is if you're going to run out of budget, let's say there's a certain amount of funding that was allocated to this agile project and you're getting towards running out of funding, then a project change request would be necessary to request more funding for the project and go to your project sponsors and stakeholders for them to approve more funding. But as long as you have funding available and you have the resources continue to be available that need to work on the project, you can continue to add more and more requirements and iterate on those requirements as necessary until you have a product that's deliverable and usable by your stakeholders. There may still be a need for a project change request process, but it's minimized to only be needed in terms of budget and or resource availability. As long as you have budget and resources available, then you wouldn't need a project change request. I want to reiterate, some of the scope, schedule, and cost considerations related to managing an agile project. So some of the considerations related to scope management, and we've already mentioned some of these things, but requirements are going to continuously evolve. An agile approach becomes more viable when a project first starts up. You may not know a lot of the details about what needs to get delivered. So the idea behind Agile as it relates to scope management is that the requirements will continue to evolve as the project progresses. And Agile allows for that to happen just based on the nature of what an Agile project is and how it's managed. It lends itself well to projects where the requirements and more detailed requirements need to continuously evolve during the course of the project. There's intent to spend less time up front trying to define and agree upon the scope early in the stage of the project and spend more time on establishing the process for the ongoing discovery and refinement of the requirements as they're identified. They purposely build and review prototypes. So you mentioned earlier, one of you mentioned that you were involved in developing a prototype and learning on how that prototype was working and how the improvements needed evolve and continuously improve how the prototype was working. And once you get to something that's working, then that prototype can easily be turned into more of a production type of a product or service. Scope is continuously defined and redefined throughout the course of the project. Requirements, as we mentioned, constitute the backlog and are maintained in what's called the product or requirements backlog. Ideally, the sponsor and or customer representative are continuously engaged in the project, constantly providing feedback on the deliverables as they are created to ensure the product backlog reflects their current needs. And the collection, refining of scope, scope validation, controlling are repeated for each iteration of the project, and those iterations are typically called sprints. Yes.
Quick question. Do you find any correlation between an agile approach or waterfall approach based on project team size? Or I'm wondering, a project team that has a lot of members, well developed, that might have the resources and horsepower to go through some of the steps
Yeah.
and define requirements and things, take the time to do that, but do it quick enough so that a waterfall approach could be used, or a smaller team that has less members that is going to kind of be figuring things out as they go would then use an agile approach. Do you see any correlation there?
A lot of the teams, the agile teams that I've seen are typically 8, 10, 12 people at the most. So they do lend themselves more to smaller teams. The concept of everybody working closely together, a lot of times being in the same room outside of the quarantining that we're currently in, but typically being involved in the same location. That concept is known as co-location, by the way. So co-location, you might come across in the materials, means having all your resources in one location. And a lot of times in an agile project, they'll be in the same room working closely together. So to answer your question, yeah, agile lends itself well to smaller teams, 6, 8, 10, no more than 12 people working on a team. And another thing that you can have is parallel teams working side by side, working on different aspects of a project. So once the scope is large enough, you might have different parallel teams broken up and working in parallel, working on different levels of scope can be worked on simultaneously, but independently of each other to continuously make progress on the project. So is that what you've seen as, parallel teams working on different types of this, different categories of scope?
Yeah. Yes, and I guess when you say the group that I had experience with that was doing the project work in a more agile approach was smaller and co-located in the same location on the software team. But I'm just thinking, I know the requirement stage in the project can take many, many weeks to go through them all, make sure everybody feels they've all been captured, review of them. And that's not very agile, but that process had a lot of group members that had some time for it. Even a smaller group, I think, could take even longer to do that, which
Yep.
is definitely not agile. But when you have multiple people from different functions that were dedicated to doing that, you can go through that process in the waterfall approach, but it still takes quite a long time.
Yeah, it sounds like you were using what's known as more of a hybrid approach, where the planning, involved more people and involved a larger team, and you're trying to make sure that you built your product backlog or your requirements backlog to a sufficient level and comprehensiveness before you started iterating. You got into execution and started iterating on your product requirements backlog.
Yes,
so that would be known as what I would consider a hybrid approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think when you're identifying your requirements, if there isn't just one or two product owners that know enough to be able to identify, a comprehensive set of requirements that need to get delivered upon, then you might need a larger team involved up front to identify, what your product requirements backlog needs to look like, what needs to be included in those requirements before you start down the agile approach of iterating on the delivery of those requirements. As we've talked about, another name for agile is adaptive when it comes to the PMBOK and PMI. Adaptive or agile or iterative approaches use short cycles or sprints to undertake work. So your schedule, instead of, the earlier schedule template that I showed you was more of a waterfall approach where it's broken down into phases. So broken down into initiation, everything that would need to get done, and planning, what needs to get done in execution, and then finally closing. Well, an agile plan or schedule might look like, you might have your initiation and planning phase, But then when you get into execution, your execution is broken down into a number of sprint cycles. And so you're going to have your tasks that need to get done within each sprint broken up into different sprint cycles. So let's say you have 100 requirements that need to get delivered that are part of your requirements backlog. And you've decided you're going to use 3-week sprint cycles. And let's say the team has decided on average, you can deliver 8 requirements in each 3-week sprint cycle. So on your schedule, you're going to break up your execution phase of your schedule to identify the progress and the tasks that are needed to deliver in each sprint cycle. If you have 100 requirements and you have 8, on average, 8 requirements can get delivered and during each 3-week sprint cycle, that means you're going to need at least 12 sprint cycles. 12 times 8 is 96. You're going to need at least 12 sprint cycles on your schedule to reflect and track the progress that you're making on your schedule. So that would just be one way of doing it. But the sprint cycles are a way of providing rapid feedback on the approaches and suitability as you deliver the requirements during subsequent sprint cycles. They're generally iterative and pull-based scheduling. Pull-based scheduling means as requirements are completed by the team is going to pull down the next requirement that needs to get worked on and delivered from the backlog. That's what's meant by pull-based scheduling. And as new requirements are pulled down from the backlog, you're going to add the delivery of those requirements to your schedule and making sure you're adhering to your 3-week sprint cycle. Scaling factors include team size, geographical distribution, regulatory requirements, organizational complexity, technical complexity. As you alluded to earlier, team size, might dictate how well you're going to adhere to. Team size has to do with the number of resources that you have working on the requirements that you're trying to deliver, what their geographical distribution is. Ideally, in an ideal Agile world, everybody is in one location they're co-located, working closely on delivering the requirements that need to get delivered. Your organizational complexity has to do with how well your organization is set up to allow you to work in this Agile approach. Are your team members able to be co-located? Or you might have team members that are in different cities that, where you're using video and telephone conference calling to communicate with your people. I think one of you mentioned that you're in a different your team members are in a location, but your project manager is remote and communicating remotely on a daily basis or a regular basis with the project team members. And then the technical complexity in terms of what you're trying to deliver will lend itself to either, whether an Agile approach can be used or a non-Agile approach. The role of the project manager does not change when managing projects using predictive or adaptive styles. Again, adaptive has to do with iterative, Agile approaches. Predictive, from a PMI terminology standpoint, has to do with a more sequential or waterfall approach to delivering your projects. The project manager needs to be familiar with the tools and techniques in order to understand how to apply them effectively when managing either waterfall or Agile adaptive life cycles. In our organization, we allow the project manager to choose what approach they're going to manage their project, whether they're going to use a more waterfall approach, the tools and techniques related to managing a waterfall, or whether they're going to use a more Agile approach and iterate in sprint cycles on the delivery of the requirements that need to get delivered. So those are some of the agile considerations as it relates to managing your schedule. The last thing I wanted to talk about today is the considerations related to cost management, related to agile, cost management. So projects related with high degrees of uncertainty, or those where the scope is not yet fully defined, may not benefit from detailed cost calculations due to frequent changes. When we're talking about detailed cost calculations, that has to do with some of the calculations related to earned value management. The thing that you will have, though, and need to be responsible for managing is, even though it's an agile project, you're still going to have a budget associated to the project that you're going to manage. If you have external expenditures, that as you get invoices, you issue purchase orders, you get invoices against your project, you're going to have to track the actual cost of those external expenditures versus your budget. If you're responsible for managing the cost of your resources, as your project continues to progress, you would need to track the cost of your resources versus what was actually budgeted for your resources. So although you're managing your project in an agile manner or agile approach, there are still some cost and budget implications that you'll be responsible for as the project manager. Instead of more detailed estimation methods that might be used up front to estimate, how long it's going to take to deliver the different requirements, there are more lightweight estimation methods that can be used and that are used when it comes to managing a project. I mentioned earlier a point-based estimation technique. So what your team will do, they won't try to do this for every single requirement like they would maybe on a waterfall project, but within each sprint and the sprint planning session comes to estimating agile work effort. And as you get into each sprint planning session, you're going to have your prioritized list of requirements that need to get delivered within that sprint. Well, your team is going to use this point-based estimation technique. Approach I've seen uses a Fibonacci number where you go 1 point, 2 points, whatever the Fibonacci numbers are. Is it what? 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, something like that. So they're going to assign different point values to each requirement that needs to get delivered within the sprint cycle, depending on the complexity, the expected complexity of the requirements. So something simple might get 1 point. A more medium complex requirement might get 3 or 5 points. A more complex requirement might get 9 points or something like that. The idea is that you're going to use this point-based estimation approach to determine, okay, during this 3-week sprint cycle, based on our prior experience, we've determined we can deliver 15 or 20 points of requirements in a 3-week sprint cycle. So it's going to help the team estimate realistically, based on the complexity of a requirement, how many requirements can be delivered within each sprint cycle. And as you continue to get experience on your subsequent sprints, the team will be able to estimate better and learn from the previous sprint cycles to learn not to overestimate the number of requirements that can realistically be delivered within each subsequent sprint cycle till you get to a minimum viable product. So that's the idea behind a lightweight estimation technique. Detailed estimates are reserved for short-term planning horizons and meant to be just in time. One of the approaches used in Agile, delivering Agile projects is known as a Kanban approach, or Kanban, Kanban, and that's based on a Japanese manufacturing technique, or just-in-time, where just-in-time inventory system. So there's a Japanese manufacturing technique called Kanban, where in an assembly line technique or approach, each worker on the assembly line only has enough inventory to perform their immediate task. Similarly, Agile uses a just-in-time approach for each person to work on specifically the task at hand that they're trying to deliver on the requirement for their sprint cycle. In cases where high variability projects are also subject to strict budgets, the scope and schedule are more often adjusted. So that's what I was mentioning earlier, where you can keep adding more and more requirements to your backlog. Those requirements can continue to be prioritized in subsequent sprint cycles as long as you don't run out of funding for your project. So once you run out of funding, then you would need to do some type of project change request in order to request more funding in order for the project to continue. But the idea in general behind Agile is the project will continue until you've delivered a minimum viable product or a usable product or service that's acceptable to your business stakeholder or your customer, whoever you're delivering that project for.
A question.
Sure.
That seems like a huge risk for blowing your budget and working in general with actually building projects for a client.
Yeah, that's a good point. And typically what's done is the organization will decide, oh, well, Mr. Agile project manager or Scrum Master, you need to come back to us and give us an update. Could be a project review board. So they're going to review, you're going to present to your project review board. Could be a quarterly basis and every 6 months or an annual basis. You need to give them a project review board presentation about the progress that you're continuing to make on the project, what your burn down charts look like, where you are in terms of the budget that was originally allocated to the project, and where you are in terms of delivering a viable product to your stakeholders. So during these project review meetings, like I said, they could be quarterly, biannual, or once a year. You're going to, get approval to continue to move forward or not get approval to move forward. So as long as you keep getting approval to move forward, the project will continue. These review board meetings are meant to minimize the risk to the organization that the project won't continue to go on forever, infinitum, but there are checkpoints along the way. Those checkpoints are meant to keep the risk at a minimum. And also, what I've seen is parts of the organization using an agile approach for delivering software. Well, the team manages themselves, but they get allocated an annual budget. So at the end of every year, they have to go back and say, oh, in order for the work to continue on this agile approach, we need $1 million more for the year or 2 million, whatever that dollar amount is, to continue developing the product or service using this agile approach. Those types of checkpoints serve to minimize the risk to the organization. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It makes sense. It just doesn't seem to be the most efficient way to minimize that risk. Because when I was working at Infinity and Audi, we had iPad apps we were developing. Well, I was working for an ad agency those were their clients. Mm-hmm. And we always seemed to blow out our time needed because requirements would constantly build or change. And then budget would generally stop, and that would be like the end point because Infinity would run out of money.
Right.
And like we couldn't test things anymore, and we're like, okay. Or the only other hard date we might have would be, okay, we want this for a convention that's happening, or it has to coincide with the new print brochures that they've released for that year. So it just still seemed to be pretty inefficient way to finalize a project and contain that risk?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the level of risk that the organization is willing to take on. To minimize that risk, having those quarterly checkpoints and reviews, I think is key to being able to minimize that risk and ensuring that the team is continuing to make progress towards the originally identified scope of the project. As new requirements get added to the backlog, I also think it's important for the project manager to oversee, what those requirements are that are being added to the backlog, and making sure that the requirements are within the originally agreed upon scope. Just a simple example is that if the scope of the project is to build a car and somebody's adding requirements into the backlog related to building an airplane, obviously the scope, those requirements for building the airplane are outside the scope, the originally agreed upon scope for building the car. So those are kind of at a very high level, kind of what the project manager needs to oversee to make sure that the requirements being identified for the backlog are still within the boundaries and originally agreed upon scope of the project. And that can help to serve to minimize the risk of what's being worked on as well. The Agile approach is meant to allow a team to constantly deliver early and often on the project instead of waiting to the very end. So in that respect, it's meant to reduce the risk of what's being delivered versus waiting to the very end of a 6 or 9 or 12-month project and determining that what was delivered isn't going to work for the organization. It's meant to serve to reduce the risk, but I can see where you're coming from. Without those checkpoints along the way, making sure that the budget is being used efficiently and towards the delivery of the right requirements within the scope of the originally agreed upon project, that there is a certain amount of risk related to this Agile approach as well. But all those risks need to be managed on an ongoing basis throughout the course and the life cycle of the project.